Good morning. Today I would like to share with you the story of the widow of Nain. It's found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verse 11. Now that day, Jesus, followed by his disciples and a great crowd, were heading in the direction of the small hillside village of Nain, a long day's walk from the shores of Lake Galilee. The disciples had not a care in the world, enjoying Jesus' company, soaking up his teaching, following Jesus. Verse 12. And as they reached the gate of the town of Nain, they met another crowd coming out of the town gates, and the two crowds came face to face with one another. Sometimes in our lives, we come face to face with a reality that we would rather not meet at all, that we would rather ignore. In Swindon, 2 weeks ago, we were abruptly stopped in our tracks by the shocking news that one of our friends at church, a deacon, husband, and father of 3, had been taken into hospital. Within hours, the family received a phone call from the hospital. He had been pronounced dead. With the coronavirus epidemic, we are surrounded by the news of death at the moment. But until we come face to face with it ourselves, until we get the phone call, life can meander along pretty much the same as usual, even if we are following Jesus. And the carefree crowd following Jesus at the gates of Nain came face to face with another crowd coming in the opposite direction in an entirely different state of mind. You see, at the head of this second crowd was a widow, a woman who had already lost her husband. And we are told that as Jesus approached the city gate, behold also, the widow's only son was being carried out for burial, and a crowd of that city was with her. It was hard enough to be a widow in those days, and now this widow's only son, perhaps her only hope for the future, we aren't told his age, had died also. Not only is there grief for the passing of the son, but there's also despair at the plight of the woman, the brutal incursion of death into the land of the living to snatch away someone who had passed before his time. No wonder the whole town had turned out for the funeral. It reminds me of a funeral of a young man in his 20s that we attended just about 3 years ago. When we reached his house with a hearse outside, the street was already thronging with people, and we walked with hundreds behind the hearse in a cortege entirely blocking the street, up the street and round the corner to the church. Some people were crying. His mum was nearly passing out from grief. Most voices were hushed, silent, sombre. The distress was palpable. Verse 13. And seeing the widow, the Lord had pity upon her. And the two crowds meet. The one on the way up the hill, the carefree crowd following Jesus. The other on the way down the hill, following the pallbearers and the body of the young man. Two crowds symbolizing opposite and opposed realities, life coming face to face with death. But there's a twist in the story of the widow of Nain. As Jesus speaks to the widow for the first time, he opens his mouth with 3 surprising words. Do not weep. Do not weep? Why not? I've lost my only son. Why not? I've already lost my husband. Why not? I've lost everything I had, all my hopes, and dreams, I have nothing left to live for. And as the pallbearers carrying the coffin, the open coffin with the body inside, stood still, Jesus moves forward and he touches the coffin. Verse 14. Now, you have to understand, no self-respecting Jew would have done this. You defiled yourself by touching a dead body or anything, indeed, it had touched. You made yourself ritually impure. But Jesus is not defiled. Jesus purifies. Jesus is the one who communicates life. And as he touches the coffin, he says intimately, using the vocative form, Neaniske, young man, I say to you, arise. The basic word, the basic meaning of the Greek verb agero, which underpins the English translation arise, is wake up, to wake from sleep. But it can be translated equally as stand up. On Jesus' lips, it is a word of power. And we reach Luke 15 and are brought up abruptly by one of the most surprising sentences in all of literature. And the dead man sat up. Even today, colliding with that sentence, as a reader, we are shocked. If so, imagine the impact on the crowd of mourners. They were afraid, awestruck. This is not the natural flow of things. Life flows down the hill, just like the funeral cortege. It ends in death. Things decay. It's the law of entropy. Dead men don't sit up. But the text says, verse 15, and the dead man sat up, and he began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. This is one of 3 occasions in the New Testament that Jesus is recorded as having raised someone from the dead. The widow of Nain's son, Jairus' daughter, and his own friend, Lazarus. And on the first 2 occasions, the word which Jesus used was this word, agero, arise. This significant word, which appears 144 times in the New Testament, 13 times refers to the raising of dead people. 52 times it's used for the raising of Christ. 20 times it refers to the eschatological resurrection, the raising of those who die in Christ. In this single word that Jesus spoke to the widow of Nain's son, and which is translated in English, arise, we are connected from the moment that the dead man sat up through to Jesus' own resurrection and to the promise that we too, if we believe in him, will rise in Christ. I wish that before the burial of our brother from Swindon that takes place this Wednesday, we could present him back to his widow, back to his sons, alive, just as Jesus presented her son back to the widow of Nain. We cannot do that. It's beyond our power. But it is not beyond Jesus' power. Indeed, on each of the 3 occasions when he raised someone from the dead, Jesus' words remind us of the following fundamental truth. To Jesus, you see, to God, death is only a sleep. Leroy Froome demonstrated this to be the teaching of the entire Bible in a monumental 2-volume study entitled The Conditionalist Faith of Our Fathers. He concluded, sleep is the undeviating synonym for death throughout the Bible, occurring no less than 66 times in 17 books of the canon. You see, we do not go to heaven or to hell at the point of death. We sleep. And sleep implies that we will awake. As Paul wrote in his letter to the believers, his first letter to the believers at the church at Thessalonica, and I will end with this. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words.